Yeah, very excited to talk about VPPs, virtual power plants, and distributed energy resources. Incredible panel here today. We're going to talk a lot about like what does it take to actually scale things up, and give you a sense of the landscape, the markets, as well as give some advice in terms of if you are developing battery integrated products, how do you actually factor this into your own strategy? So here we got Rishi Simha, who started his career at Solar City, so no need to talk about the impact there. And then to Tesla Energy, where he was actually starting out a lot of their storage business for residential. And then VP of Finance at Lunar Energy, which he is now in charge of, I think, over $500 million of funding. So a lot of capital to be deployed. Very exciting. And their software manages 650 megawatts of distributed energy devices. So again, really, really excited to have you here. Thomas, so his career started at Enphase, is my understanding, and then founded Leap at 2017. Yeah, maybe just briefly, you have over 400,000 distributed energy resources connected, and you guys just entered PJM, so really at a scale phase, so very excited to have you here. Thank you. And Ben, you've been building hardware, software devices for quite a while now and fell in love with the energy markets, and now you're building the kind of magic black box to make essentially anything an energy resource, it sounds like, so very excited to dig into that. To set the stage, I realize this is essentially cliche at this point, AI data centers, load growth, but hard to set the scene any better in terms of putting to the test what is a virtual power plant and can it actually deliver what was promised. So really want to get into that and maybe use this as an opportunity to talk about your companies. And maybe just to start with Rishi, in terms of how you think about the market evolving and kind of the price signals you're seeing, how would you actually characterize this load growth, and are you seeing those in the numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. It's been funny because it's been SF Climate Week, and then everywhere I go, it's actually like AI Week or Defense Tech Week. But in the end, I think because energy is so fundamental, it ends up intersecting the Climate Week ecosystem as well. In terms of directly answering your question on AI data centers and how things fit in, listen, load growth is off the charts. On Tuesday, I went to a panel that was from the CEO of Halcyon, Nat Bullard. They kind of did a whole history of the grid. And one of the graphs that most stands out to me is we've kind of had flat load growth for the past 3 decades. And then with the advent of data centers, you just see the hockey stick just going. And, historically, data centers have been 100, 200 megawatts. Now there's 60 plus data centers being sited over a gigawatt each. So, all of those are the ones that have already been planned, let alone the ones that are happening internationally and elsewhere. So there's a huge demand there. And each one, I think, has different needs and different challenges. And I think one way distributed resources can really play a role here is helping address some of the congestion. You can pair these data centers with a front-of-the-meter asset, but that's going to take 5 to 7 years of interconnection queues. Or over a 12-month period, you could site 10,000, 20,000 batteries at a specific node and help address the congestion there. And we've already been in a lot of those talks.
Yeah, super exciting. And we'll get into a little bit more about your solution in a second, but would love to throw it over to Thomas. I mean, you started Leap in 2017, so I can't imagine anybody can speak more to how things have changed since then. So tell us a little bit more about Leap, what you envisioned when you first started it, and what it's looking like right now.
So Leap is a platform, a backend to operate virtual power plants at scale. And we have partnerships left and right, and are the backend to a lot of VPPs that you've seen and come to love. The idea of a virtual power plant is not new. I mean, that concept, was in academia in 2010, but actually building a virtual power plant that can match what another power plant does, like for like, that has really been something from the last couple of years, maybe. And back in the days, VPPs in California, we could already in 2017 under a program called DRAM, doesn't exist anymore, participate as a power plant in the wholesale market. So you compete against other power plants. And already we proved that, at that point in time, you're competing at the transmission grid level, and we were more economical and could get this to capacity faster. And all the muscle that we build on actually operating reliable power plants that operate in the wholesale market, that get the same amount of penalties if they don't show up, right? That is now really coming to fruition because of the congestion locally, right? Virtual power plants are finally getting their premium paid for being local. Right? We're solving the congestion locally in the grid, not at the transmission level, but really where it's needed. And to tie it back to Climate Week, if you look at load growth, the easiest way, and what's happening right now, unfortunately, is that a lot of that load growth is, fueled by gas and other, polluting resources. Virtual power plants, by the definition, are the ones that are actually not contributing to emissions. So, if we build out more virtual power plants, more batteries, more access to capacity, demand response is part of that too. You actually reduce the emissions on the grid while you serve that load growth. And last thing, very important. You also cap or even reduce the rates that people are paying, because guess who's paying the upgrades to the grid if a data center gets connected, and we are all paying for infrastructure upgrades. That's socialized, right? It's part of your rates, so they go up if a data center connects, and they're trying to resolve that and come with pay for your own rate. But this actually is a really good solution.
So just to make sure everybody has this context, and so I'm trying to build sort of a mental framework. When you talk about a virtual power plant, are you selling energy on that wholesale market? Are you selling energy, or are you selling capacity? And to what extent do you see that evolving? Because kind of going back to the data center question, I assume they need baseload power. Their gap is maybe what they're looking at for peaker plants. How do you actually see that demand, that need getting resolved by the virtual power plant? Like, what's the mechanism by which it actually meets that need?
Yeah, I would consider a virtual power plant. There's different concepts and flavors, but let's just compare it to a existing peaker plant, right? Virtual power plants are not going to deliver you 24/7 base load, right? That's where bigger power plants are for, nuclear, like base load power. We're really competing against peaker plants, but that's still a very significant side of the market. Dispatching maybe 10, 20 hours a month, like for real participation in the wholesale market. And to answer your first part of your question, we're selling capacity, energy, and all the other services that normal power plants do in the wholesale market, and that's now also selling to the local distribution grid.
Awesome. And I know Lunar is doing a lot of the residential batteries. Maybe to throw it over to Ben, tell us a little bit about the device you're building, and maybe like what is the class of assets that you think are currently undertapped in terms of playing in this market or helping match demand to supply?
It's going to be a little bit backwards. The answer isn't, everyone's going to get a heat pump hot water heater and that's going to solve everything. A lot of this comes down to the mechanism, at least our belief around the mechanism around how virtual power plants and participants in them get compensated. And so when you think about kind of the primary asset for VPPs, which is a home battery, or soon to be V2G assets, a lot of our belief around where things are going and where technology has to be built is this precision interface between the assets themselves and the utilities and the operating platform behind it all. I think a lot of this comes down to the holdover from the earliest days of VPPs. VPP 1.0 was relays on your air conditioner. Just nope, that doesn't get to work anymore. Yeah. VPP 2.0 is great. Now we have APIs to to your Nest thermostats. Maybe you have an API to your Enphase battery. But a lot of the dispatch comes down to, great, there are these windows of stress. We are going to dispatch these assets. They have 5 minutes or so to respond, to be compensated. When we think about VPP 3.0, and part of what we build for is this real-time high-performance participation, where you're bringing in actual grid condition sensing, and the role of the utility becomes much more of setting up the rules of engagement so that these assets can participate autonomously in a very low latency and high precision way. To us, that's how you primarily unlock more value, therefore more compensation, and finally more participation.
And maybe to put a specific point on that too is right now there's all these EV managed charging programs, and those are kind of binary, like we'll just stop charging your car. In the long term, where you can see things going is, hey, we're going to dispatch your home battery of a certain amount of kilowatt hours at a certain kilowatts to the grid, or same with your vehicle. And so I think maybe that's kind of what you were alluding to, evolving from 2.0 to 3.0.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue. So in preparation for this, was doing some reading, and there's this new concept out called the Huels test, which is essentially the Turing test for whether you are actually getting energy from a real power plant or a virtual power plant. And I think that's a really interesting framing because it kind of begs the question of like, what are the technical and market gaps that exist? Because if I think about, deploying batteries and I want to get maximum value, obviously the closer you get to that, the better off you are. So maybe we can just go down the line and like, where do you see the biggest gaps and technological challenges right now?
Yeah, I hope this isn't too controversial, but I actually don't think there are any technical gaps anymore. I would say, if you Google the Huels test real quick, it's spelled like the protein shake, HUEL. You can see, basically there's all the way to level 4, and Lunar at least is already at level 4. Which is, at the end of the day, electron is fungible, and so the grid really can't tell the difference. And if anything, we're actually a lot more precise about it. So one thing that we've been able to do already last July as part of the DSGS program, we were able to do a test where we dispatched 500 megawatts on a hot day and really supported the grid. There's also this SAVE program where they'll say, hey, try and hit these specific load profiles, and by commanding a fleet of batteries, EV chargers, et cetera, you're able to meet the grid's needs exactly. So I think we're already there from a technology. It's much more a getting people comfortable with it. And I think a thing that people are starting to realize is if you just oversubscribe the amount of batteries or whatever asset, heat pump, water heaters, et cetera, then you can deal with this problem that maybe 5 to 10% may not show up. So I think we're already there. And, in a way, I'd be remiss if I didn't say we've got, Sunrun as a key partner of ours. And they're like, there's nothing virtual about a virtual power plant. So if you've ever been to any panels where they're speaking, they call it a distributed power plant. It's because it's not a virtual power plant anymore. It's real. It's already happening all the time.
Yeah, they're totally physical assets that are dispatched and are delivering exactly the same as a traditional power plant does. So the Huels test, our partner Energy Hub came up with that. And as you said, right, it's a Turing test for any non-observant grid operator or the observant grid operator, they should not be able to distinguish if power is delivered by a peaker plant or a virtual power plant. It should be exactly the same rules, regulation. I think that's an important part too, because technically we can do this. But the grid operators still sometimes, think, all right, these virtual power plants have a different treatment, right? There's pay for performance, there's no penalty clause. So we've been actually operating in these wholesale markets where we are penalized if we don't show up, right? The exact same rules and regulations. And I think that gets grid operators much more comfortable that this is a dispatchable, reliable asset. We're not going to provide base load, but a peaker plant is not doing that either. But we're there, and we're going to deliver that capacity at the times that you want. And the energy, real time, dispatch, you can dispatch 10,000s of batteries and they will respond. And they are actually more fault tolerant than peaker plants. Peaker plants sometimes go out in in-plant maintenance and you can't rely on it. And a virtual power plant is by definition much more reliable too.
I think that's one of the pieces that isn't enough in the common discourse is that those of us that are operating at the bleeding edge of VPPs, we are screaming, give us the double-edged sword. Yeah. Like, give us the pain, give us the penalties, so long as you're going to give us the other side of the improved incentive. We want it because we know we can operate to that.
So maybe to piggyback off of that, if I'm thinking about a physical power plant, I'm thinking about a specific location that can turn on at specific points in time. So there's kind of like two dimensions of where this has to show up. And you building a DER management system, you have to actually have a lot of intelligence around that predictability, where the energy is showing up. Can you just give me a sense for like, how do you track that? And do you have to resolve like where this shows up in the market? And are you playing at the distribution grid level, or are we talking about the transmission level? Like how granular can we get with regards to space and time?
Yeah, I mean, like everything eventually rolls up to transmission level constraints, But this is like you had asked a question previously around like what's missing from the tech stack. This is like topological certainty around the distribution grid. This is one of those pieces where there isn't quite enough data out there yet and quite enough sensing to really understand how energy is flowing through the distribution grid. And so much of the way that the problem is dealt with is just build more capacity, spend more money on oversizing every piece of the physical infrastructure, because we as utilities don't really know how to figure out the topological certainty around how everything works. It's one of the things that at Elastic we work on. How are different sites connected? What are we seeing through signal analysis? What are we seeing in similarities from power entering this house or this business? How do we build a imperfect, hazy, but at least start of a model around what the distribution grid looks like, so that eventually we can work with partners like Leap and others to say, great, like we understand how these assets are connected together and how they could respond together, so that the dispatch against grid constraints isn't just great. We have too much solar and that needs to be consumed, or we don't have enough generation and bring on more assets. Let's get down to the individual feeder level, even down to a neighborhood transformer. If you start to build this deeper understanding of the distribution grid, you're going to find a ton of system efficiency in that.
So is that where the opportunity is? Because when you said, oh, we just tend to, in order to add new load, we just build out more of the grid. But I think what we're seeing with EV chargers and now AI is like, hey, there's real value to doing this quickly. So what is the sort of temperature of the utilities themselves of actually like looking at these technologies as a viable solution? Are there any direct purchase agreements possible? Like if you've got a neighborhood of assets and then you want to build out a data center, can you actually connect the dots without having to do massive infrastructure upgrades?
Yeah, I can talk to that. So virtual power plants currently participating under FERC regulations, right? That's law of the land, right? It's been time tested. We know if we bring a megawatt in PJM or in New York, needs to happen and we get paid X for performance. That's not resolved yet at the distribution level. All the distribution utilities have their own grid planning team that have to have to sign off, like this megawatt that's here right now operated by this virtual power plant actually is headroom that we can allocate to this data center on the same feeder. Right? That's new and it's happening right now. I mean, a lot of utilities are thinking about this. We have good conversation with PG&E, for instance, about specifically this. And the interesting thing is as you said, right, the data that we get is at the site level. I mean, of all those hundreds of thousands of customers that we have on the platform, we have exactly their meter data, to the 5-minute increment on how much they delivered, when they delivered. We dispatch, of course, the assets that go through partners like us that do the actual dispatching. And that headroom that we then build up for a local large load, a data center, you can match that one-to-one. And the alternative is just building out the peak demand for a distribution grid, right? If a data center needs 100 megawatts of connection, just add 100 megawatt of interconnection. I don't think that's the most economical solution. It will take a long time. We all will pay for that because our rates go up. And essentially, you're asking, the equivalent would be asking Amazon to keep a year worth of stock, in their warehouses, just to plan for that one day of the year or 2 days, 100 hours a year, where you actually get close to the peak capacity of that distribution grid. Well, there's tons of flexibility. You can do temporal changes, or what we're doing, of course, is allocating capacity from from homeowners and commercial operations that have batteries in the same feeder to dispatch when the capacity gets constrained, and then you're looking at 100, 200 hours a year maybe, and then that grid can take 2x the capacity.
That's really interesting. So I'm kind of hearing about the different parties that you work with, and maybe this is a good segue to get into understanding the landscape. So suppose I am, building one of these products with battery enabled. there's a lot of different players in this space, and I feel like there's a lot of acronym soup that we could use here. So I think it's interesting because maybe we should talk a bit about Lunar and your business model, because I think it speaks to essentially like certain virtues that you get with batteries, and how you can actually coordinate things that you get more value out of it. So can you explain a little bit about the philosophy behind Lunar and this idea of controlling both hardware and software?
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, I don't want this to be a sales pitch for Lunar, but maybe to step back a little bit, our mission, I think like many people's missions in this room at Climate Week, is how can we power homes around the world with endless clean energy? And I think we're at this liminal moment, right? It's like we have huge load growth coming, and the alternative is to power it with natural gas generators. So we really have a lot of work ahead of us. So I think there's a few different ways that we could structure it. Lunar, as a hardware manufacturer, we're a little agnostic to the business model. We're happy to participate however it works. So one option that we see, if you think of the key different stakeholders, especially as it relates to this data center problem, is the data center, the utility, and then ultimately the folks required for the VPP, the hardware and the software. So one way to do it is to say, hey, we'll partner with, and I see lots of potential partners out there. I see Ravi in the back at Atmos. There's other TPO players, Sunrun, et cetera. There's just the original model of sell equipment to installers install it, and then there's aggregators who can take those already installed assets and pitch it to help provide the power at a local data center hub, and provide the power there. Then there's other models where you can partner with the utility directly. Maybe you've heard of the CEC Choir program as an example of that. You can partner with a utility, the CEC, and say, hey, the utility business model is to rate base assets. Maybe they can just, instead of paying for the next peaker plant, they can pay for 10,000 home batteries, and they get the right of first use on those on like the 200 hours a year they most want it. And then meanwhile, the customers get the 24/7 backup. So there's all these different innovative models that you could do. And I think what really matters is I hope people leave the room realizing the technology already exists. We need to solve the humans coordinating action problem here and get all the right people in the room, and I think we can make it happen.
Maybe on that point, I'd love to throw it over to Ben, because I feel like you gave a very interesting framing of this as an AI problem. And if I think about the level of complexity we're dealing with, you already talked about actually tracking what's happening on the distribution grids. You have prices, you have different offtake agreement models. How are you thinking about how these markets evolve? And maybe you can speak a little bit to your strategy around this sort of like AI-centric model.
Yeah, a couple months ago, there was a really interesting conference in Presidio called the Type 1 Summit. And the strongest takeaway I had from that summit was this consensus that we are going to be a rounding error on the grid. And that is a eye-opening and somewhat terrifying thought. When you think about, if you just extrapolate the level of growth and level of adoption and the power hungriness that AI has, that this is a very, very different type of future than what we've been building for up until a few years ago. And so when you think about, and Rishi spoke to this, is when you think about, okay, how do we value virtual power plants? How do we value this? We like to call it transactive capacity on the grid. A lot of this comes down to, well, if the best customer for your capacity is going to be AI compute, how do you build a business model around selling capacity to AI compute? Again, it's all down to time and speed to power. It's all down to being able to power more and more inference and training cycles. I don't know if that fully answered the question. Maybe a little bit of a soapbox.
Yeah, and maybe I'll use this to transition to Thomas. So we have a lot of different battery technologies represented here. And one of the things that, at least from my understanding, we saw with solar is that when there was this massive build out, at some point you started to see this like level of cannibalization, right? Where like the nth panel that went on, it meant for everybody else the value of the electrons being produced is lower, which I think poses an interesting question for storage in particular. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you share a similar concern for storage? Do you see this providing need for, different durations? What are the sort of solutions that you see emerging that will prevent that from happening as like many people are kind of making capital investments for these types of assets?
Man, I wish I knew the answer there, but I used to be a solar developer, utility scale solar developer, and wind, and cannibalization was a big thing. Everyone that has a solar plant produces at the exact same time, therefore price go down, right? So that is cannibalization. And you can pair it with a battery, and you can move, time shift your production. We are seeing it in Texas right now, where the prices are actually getting compressed on the wholesale level because of massive build out. In California, I mean, we have 10 gigawatts of batteries here right now, maybe bigger even, 16. Oh, yeah, you need to keep track of that. And it's definitely cannibalizing the ancillary services, but there's plenty of opportunity in energy arbitrage. If we are becoming an afterthought, I don't think there's going to be a point in time where there's no need for all of the above solutions, right? Long form, long storage, lithium, short duration, seasonal, diurnal, everything. Yeah, it's almost like the water issue in California, right? Where I looked into we're saving water. Don't take a shower if there's a drought. Turns out like 0.1% maybe of water use is actually residential, or maybe 2. 30% goes to growing alfalfa, right? So if we are at a point in time where we become an afterthought, there is going to be need for all of these solutions 24/7 a day.
Yeah, maybe the thing I'd add is if you take a view of how things were in the past and apply it to the future, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's a huge induced demand that can happen if you mass deploy solar and batteries, grid scale, utility scale, C&I. I think a thing that we haven't had a chance to touch on the panel yet is the real problem of affordability. And really, the cost is driven by transmission and distribution. Generation is pretty cheap nationwide in the US. And so if we're able to deploy these things, and now instead of 60 cents a kilowatt hour that I'm paying in my San Francisco apartment at 19th and Valencia, if instead over time we can see our rates come down, what does that actually mean? I think we're not understanding where having this extra batteries, solar, ready to go, cheap, free, clean power, there's like a whole induced demand of what else can be accomplished if that's available.
Yeah, so maybe if I can tack on to that, and sorry to claim it here, but that's exactly true, right? Generation is not the issue, right? Power is cheap. It's just not in the right place, right? So getting that locally delivered is what we're all about. And virtual power plants are, by the nature, the asset that it's at the grid edge, right?
It's already where it needs to be.
Exactly.
So if you look at the total cost of building a battery, and maybe I'll pick on you as the finance guy here, it seems like you get economies of scale by building really, really big batteries. I'm hearing, hey, there are these other points of value in terms of having more localized storage. And then, of course, for customers, I think there's other factors like resiliency. So if we put all these market dynamics around VPPs into picture, like how much of that does it cover in terms of the whole cost of the premium you're paying to have distributed batteries versus like centralized, very large scale? So given you're in this market, how much does this change the techno-economics, and like, how would anybody plan for their business model under the number of uncertainties you guys just talked about?
Sure. As the finance guy, maybe I can start with some numbers. I think it's smart for nascent technologies to start at the expensive end of the cost curve and then kind of come down. So right now we've been talking a lot about virtual power plants as replacements for peaker plants, which are the most expensive, and that makes sense. Rena or anybody else, it can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least in California, it's like 600 gigawatts is like kind of like on the peak most day where you're getting. And if you even do 10% of that, that's 60 gigawatts. There's a huge opportunity just there alone. So to me, I think we're maybe 2 decades away from thinking about where does residential versus utility scale come in and the cost structure. It's like step one, let's just replace fossil fuel burning peaker plants as much as we can for our air, for affordability, for the climate crisis. And that is already achievable kind of today at the economics that we are. And sure, you're right, to compete with a residential battery and solar versus a utility scale battery and solar farm for your base load power, if that even ever really existed, we're not there yet. But also, the TAM of just replacing peakers to start with is so large and is going to be a many-year journey already.
Yeah, even getting into like what comes after, we can cannibalize peaker plants. We can also cannibalize transmission lines.
Yeah.
If you're doing the right kind of dispatch, the right combination of controllable loads, storage, and generation within a community scale or even a small city scale, this is where you stop needing the larger, greater part of the grid for a lot of these peak hours. You don't have to think about reconductoring. You don't have to think about new rights of ways for your lines. You just don't have to use them in the first place. It's pretty incredible what virtual power plants are starting to do in terms of just the grid is just working differently, and it's all being driven from the edge.
And maybe on that point, there seems to be a ton of value that's shared if we go this route. What is the actual attribution to the actual devices themselves? Like, are you seeing the business models, the financial models for battery-enabled assets like changing meaningfully based on these factors? And do you expect that to like evolve and in what direction?
So, and from a market perspective, right, the price signal is already there, right? You as a consumer are on a peak and an off-peak rate, right? So, and then in some utilities you actually pay a higher price per kilowatt hour bucket you enter into every month. So there's a price signal which is kind of passive. It's not real time, but it gets you to provision your battery, so you are actually arbitraging on your location. And for commercial operations, there's also something called a demand charge. So 50% almost of your utility bill, you can reduce it by just lowering your demand on a given billing period. So that price signal is there on the local side. Then there's a price signal from the wholesale and the distribution market. We pay a different price for power in San Francisco than in Oakland, right? It's already there, LMPs. So price signals are there on the side level, at the market level. Now that just needs to combine, and that price component actually becomes almost close to providing the economic incentive to install battery. When I was at Enphase, this is already 10 years ago, right? We had a beautiful product, but it didn't sell at all because the levelized cost of energy of installing solar plus a battery actually went up. So there was no price signal, and now that's completely changed.
And so to follow up on that, do you see a point at which like it makes sense to just deploy batteries at no cost into households? I'm kind of curious, like the amount we're relying on, hey, people still want resiliency. I think in Texas, there is a lot of this, like, well, there's value to the backup power, there's reducing the overall cost of energy. And yeah, if you have any kind of rough heuristics for how much the decision-making is changing, I'd be very curious, like how you look at the overall market for home batteries and how that's evolving in the next few years.
I can talk to that. So, and then maybe you can back me up with some numbers here. A residential home battery is not 100% utilized, right? Never all day, every day, right? You have a backup state of charge there just to kind of not cycle the battery too deep. Although battery technology has come so far that those 5,000 cycles you get, the battery will outlive that easily. Just like electric vehicle batteries outlive the car now, right? So the technology is there, and the quality of the battery just gets better. But you're not utilizing it perfectly if you only use it on site. So what we are saying with Leap is, let us dispatch your battery. We just get a dispatch right on that. We utilize it, but we'll make sure that you have all the service that you need, backup power, energy arbitrage if you need it. But there's still 30, 40% flexibility, headroom for us to serve the grid. And even that 40% is way more than we actually need. For frequency regulation, for instance, right, which is a little bit more out there, you don't need 40%, 10% maybe.
Yeah, maybe kind of the way I interpret your question is, hey, how can we install a shit ton of home batteries for free as quickly as possible? Maybe I'll walk you through a few different examples that I see that actually could work today. A little bit of marketing, but not much here. It's like a home battery, 30 kilowatt hours on the highest end of the home battery. You could probably get that roughly 10K today. Just use rough numbers. So start with example one, data center. We got to power 300 megawatts. And you could pay, $150 million for this distribution line upgrade, or, $150 million over a 10,000 home battery. You can do how many? 15,000 home batteries of 30 kilowatt hours. 15,000 home batteries, 150 megawatts. You're basically right there. As inverter powers go higher, you're kind of powering the need of the data center. So that's one way you could deploy home batteries for free on day one. Another way is something that's really taking off right now, not to toot our own horn, but we just announced a partnership with Octopus in Texas. Customers are getting home batteries for free up front, 30 kilowatt hour tower. Who's paying for it? The rep, the retail electricity provider. And yeah, the customer can pay a monthly lease cost, roughly $45 a month. So it's nothing up front, but they're paying a little bit for it over time, getting their electricity. Meanwhile, the rep has first access to right on the battery, and they can do the energy arbitrage with the grid because there's so much value. Rates are that dynamic. If you have the right software, you can then make money and pay for this $10,000. So there's like so many different ways to monetize this because we're in a cutting edge field. I don't think you have to pick one right solution, but order of magnitude, $10,000 battery, 30 kilowatt hours, the value is already there today. And I think if you see where the grid constraints are going, there'll only be more value from deploying these assets in scale over time.
Yeah, and so we're already doing it. We can do it. The little wrinkle is the distribution utility has to agree to this as well, right? So that's the wrinkle. We've been heavily involved in all the rulemaking. We have an incredible regulatory team that is heavily involved in making the legal framework for us to allocate those megawatts to a data center that would pay for that as if it was on-site capacity, right? The rules already exist for the wholesale level and the transmission level. Now we have to make that for the distribution level too.
Yeah, and Rishi, you spoke to something there that's really important, is this access to volatility. Like if you want to make money in a commodities market, it has to be something that has some volatility to it. You have to be able to buy low and sell high. You have to be able to have better forecasting than others. It's this access to pricing volatility and being able to do that rate arbitrage that is going to allow for operators of these assets to make money, to allow them to finance the assets and give them to people for free. This is really, really core to being able to deploy a shit ton of batteries at scale for free, is giving them access to the right pricing signals. I mean, we've already, like as an industry, taken the right steps in the right direction where, in general, you basically can't have a non-TOU rate from your utility. It used to be, call it a decade ago, you could be on a flat rate, you could be on a TOU rate. Now, any one of us can sign up for hourly flex here. So now we have hourly pricing signals. Now that you have that pricing signal and that access to the volatility, your battery can now do more than it could if you were just on the 3-tiered TOU. It's this access to volatility that unlocks the ability to make money and then finance the asset.
One quick follow-up on that. I'm curious, that's a lot of complexity for a homeowner to deal with. What are we learning about actual consumer preferences and behaviors here? And do you see like all this complexity actually kind of make it harder to adopt?
It's a freaking headache for most people. Like nobody wants to be an energy trader. And the best energy experience is no energy experience. My brief little sales pitch is, the little magic black box is essentially your own personal energy trader. It's being able to make sense of this volatility and these pricing signals and do the plan and do the dispatch in real time so you don't have to think about it. And this is, I believe Lunar makes something very similar for their systems. This is something that any of the really forward-thinking companies are, scheduled dispatch just doesn't cut it anymore. But that's what so many consumers are still being signed up for. If you go buy a bog standard battery from a no-name solar installer, the tech that's on site is going to plug in with this terrible little touchscreen, like great, charge up before 4, charge out, discharge after that. And A, there's so much being left on the table, and B, the consumer really is being done a disservice. And so it's this ability to step into that that position of kind of being the energy expert in a way that doesn't demand too much of the consumer to understand. There's a ton of white space and upside here that is going to improve access to cost savings, and from there we're going to get more and more participation in all these VPPs.
Yeah, and I know Lunar does this. It's like, I mean, at my parents' place, they have a battery and solar, and I checked like the settings. You're exactly right. The rates were from 5 years ago, so the battery was dispatching at exactly the wrong time. And if that's the case, you're doing your consumer a disservice, right?
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll say, and Ben, I'd be curious for your thoughts on this, is, there's my Lunar hat, and there's also just me as a citizen hat on as well. And, I think what matters is the ability to, earn the value that you're providing. But I don't know that necessarily needs to be exposed to the residential. You were talking about FERC 2222 or other policies as well. It's like, maybe we could have a much simpler rate structure for just your average daily consumer. As long as these behind the meter assets can be aggregated in a pool and participate on the wholesale side, then it's fine too. So it's like, at the end of the day, we just need whatever is the best mechanism to actually compensate for the value that's being provided. And then listen, I actually don't think the end customer necessarily needs to be in the Lunar app, as you guys say, like you can see for every single customer, there's like a 9-year rate schedule where hour by hour it changes over time, and so we're able to discharge the battery accordingly. But like, that's messed up. I don't actually think the customer should be exposed to that level of chaos. It's like, I just want to have some predictability and affordability in my energy bill, but there is an expensive thing happening with generation, transmission, and distribution. And so as long as there's some way to access that, that's really what matters.
You're you don't want to have to think about $1,000 per megawatt hour price swings when you're trying to cook dinner.
Yeah.
But your battery operator really wants to have access to those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had versions of that in Texas where you had a crazy price swing and people were exposed to $9,000 and got $18,000 bill in September. It wasn't great. It wasn't a great experience. And so that's changing. And what we've noticed, for instance, Leap has drop-in software that drops into the onboarding system of battery installers. So so that you actually capture the customer, authorize them at the beginning when they're actually paying attention, because the mnemonic is a customer that thinks about energy 10 minutes a year. I think that's 20 minutes now because of energy prices, but it's not much, right? So if you have to have an opt-in model, you already see incredible degradation of participation. If you then have to actually excite a customer about wholesale energy trading, that drops to 10% maybe. Yeah.
Well, I think we're at time. I could talk more for hours, but I think to put a line under it, it seems like there's a ton of change happening, and it's moving really quickly, which is also a huge opportunity. So for anybody out here, come grab these guys. These guys are the experts. Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having us.